Hello everybody and welcome to Chapelfields in Coventry. My name is Adam Wood. I'll be your guide for the next 45 minutes showing you around the Victorian watchmakers district of Chapelfields. This is the first event of the Resonate Festival, which is taking place over the next few weeks. You will have an opportunity to ask any questions throughout the tour. I won't see them, but my colleague will be picking them up on a mobile phone. There's a number on the bottom of the screen that you're looking at now. So if you have any questions, please text them through and we'll pick those up as we go along. Hopefully we'll end to 45 minutes. It's a 2-hour tour normally, so this is a condensed version. We'll end up in the community hall in 45 minutes, and then there'll be a short break and then a panel discussion. So what I'm going to do now is move away from this busy Olseley Old Road. You can probably hear the traffic there. It's a very noisy road now, lots of traffic. In the Victorian period that I'm about to be talking to you about, it was almost a dirt track because some of the houses on the other side didn't exist until the early 20th century. And we're also bordered on the other corner by Hersal Common Lane, which was also quite a quiet track at the time. Very noisy now. So without further ado, we'll move away from the traffic and we're going to walk up to this lovely Victorian building, early example of a watchmaker's factory you can see behind me. Let's move this up a little bit more so you can see me. Hopefully the sound is a little bit clearer now. Apologies for that. So hopefully I'm not going to be run over during this tour. I'm pleased that it stopped raining. We came out earlier on and it was actually torrential rain. I don't mind giving a tour in the rain, but I much prefer it when it's dry as it is now. So we're coming towards this watchmaker's factory, which was built in the late 1840s. Chapelfields was laid out in 1846 to 1848. And then basically the 20 acres of land that Chapelfields was laid out on was created because there was a mass overcrowding in Coventry city centre itself. Spon Street and Spon End, which was the watchmaking district in Coventry, was just too overcrowded. And Coventry was the centre of watchmaking in the Midlands around this time. It was a massive industry for people in Coventry. London and Liverpool in the south and the north were the main centres of industry in watchmaking, but the industry started to die down in those cities. So people came to Coventry while the industry was still buzzing. So we've just come and have a look a bit at this factory behind me. This is the watch factory of a man named Thomas Hill. He eventually became mayor of Coventry a little bit later on. Together with two of his brothers, William and Nathaniel, they also owned factories on this side of the road, the Olseley Old Road, as I said, formerly the Birmingham Turnpike Road. Those houses, they didn't exist, so these houses at the front, previously overlooking lovely fields, lakes and orchards. And this sort of factory was typical at the back there, full of windows all the way along so that they let in as much light as possible for those watchmakers doing their intricate, detailed work. Now generally, the men weren't employed by someone who owned a factory. They'd be almost self-employed, so it's a bit like the hairdressers today, renting a seat for a salon or taking work at home. They come and work in a factory if there was a week's work, or they'd take work and take it home, because every house in Chapelfields, we may see some on the tour today, had their own factory or top shop built onto the back, huge amount of windows to let the light in. They'd be working solid on these intricate parts. And one man didn't work on one pocket watch. He had a special skill, so he may make the case, he may make the movement, he may make the chain, do the engraving. It's estimated there were 35 to 40 different men working on one pocket watch. And when they'd done their part, the apprentice, usually the son, would run over to the street, hand it over to the next man in the chain, no pun intended, until the watch was complete, and then handed on to the person who commissioned it. Very, very busy area. Now, just before we move on, if we can just have a look over the road back at the pub called the Four Provinces there. Chapelfields itself has a very long history, long before the watchmakers came here in the 1840s. At the time it was nursery gardens, orchards all around here. There's Hersal Common, which is at the top of Chapelfields, came round, a very rural area. And this area where the Four Provinces is now was previously a leper hospital, because during the Crusades, unfortunately one of the men came back with leprosy. And it was decided to set up a lepers hospital with a chapel here, because it was far enough outside Coventry city centre not to cause a danger to the inhabitants of that time. This was around 1100. The chapel, which was attached to the hospital, was St Mary Magdalene's chapel. There obviously is one now at the top, which is where we're going to end up for the panel. but this version was built around 1100, and when it was eventually demolished, that gave the name to the Chapelfields, which is where we are now. We're going to carry on walking up Craven Street, which is really the spine of Chapelfields. There are 3 roads running off the Victorian era: Mount Street, Lord Street and Duke Street. We don't have time in this 45-minute segment to look at all of those, all those houses, and obviously nearly every house with a history which is 175 years old is going to have a lot of history. So what I'm going to be doing is not only talking about some of the watchmaking community, but also some of the work that the people and their lives that they carried out while they were here. We try not to get run over as we cross over Craven Street again and carry walking up. And you can probably see behind me the irregularity of these houses. There's some more recent 1980s edition. Unfortunately, Chapelfields, like much of Coventry, took a lot of bombing damage during the Second World War, Coventry Blitz. So you will see as we go along the tour some more recent editions, 1980s in the main. But certainly on this side of the road is the original Victorian houses, built in between 1850 and 1870 in the main. All of them would have been that plain red brick. The rendering and the pebble dashing is a 1970s edition mostly. Now, one of the things that anyone who follows me online or has been on one of my previous walking tours will know that my real interest is dark history. I love the social side of it. Why do these things happen? And I've written a book that some of you may have read called The Watchmaker's Revenge, which talks about the actions in 1880 of a watchmaker named Oliver Style. He lived here on Craven Street for a short time in the house over the other side of the road there. Now, Oliver was a very jealous man. He was a very skilled watchmaker, but he got himself into a situation where he believed his wife was having an affair. She wasn't, as it turned out, but Oliver really felt that something was going on. And eventually he went to Birmingham, bought a revolver and a box of 50 cartridges, and he went off and shot 6 people. None of them died, I'm pleased to say. None of them died, but it was a miracle that they didn't. Now, he and his wife and the family lived in this house on Chapelfields, no doubt very busy, engaged in the watchmaking industry, bringing in lots of work. They had a son and a daughter while they were here. The daughter sadly died of scarlet fever, a very common ailment, disease in the Victorian period. So a mixture of happy times and tragedy for Oliver, and they'd left Chapelfields by the time this incident happened, where he became estranged from his wife Harriet and went off to purchase that revolver. Another little story from The Watchmaker's Revenge coming up shortly. So we're carrying on walking up Chapelfields now. We will get opportunity for any questions as we come along, because there are a couple of areas where we got a minute or two to answer those. So you can see Chapelfields is on a bit of a hill. It's sort of sloping round to the right. Just coming up on the right hand side of the moment is Duke Street. We don't have time to go down there today, but it's part of my full tour. If anyone would like to come on in the future. We're just going to walk up to these couple of pubs coming up on the right hand side now, which are the Coombe Abbey Tavern and the Hersal. You'll notice on Craven Street, and certainly throughout Chapelfields, a lot of pubs. And it's well known in Coventry, people visiting Coventry, the Craven Street run, lots of alcohol, lots of opportunity to go and have a beer. And it's no accident, because in the watchmaking era, when these self-employed gentlemen were looking for work, they'd more often than not would come to one of these pubs, and they'd be bargaining, see who's got some work. Either they'd knock on the door of the factory, such as the one we saw for Thomas Hill, or they'd come in the pub, who's got some work, who needs a case polisher, who needs a chain maker. So they'd pick up work. Now the problem with that is that they'd be bartering against each other to get the best deal. So the person who was basically getting the work would get guaranteed getting a good price. And we're here later on the tour. Eventually there was a sort of watchmakers union formed to guarantee that they got a decent price. Now the pub behind me, the Coombe Abbey, again, it's I think the first pub in, one of the first pubs in Chapelfields, certainly the second oldest, if not the first. It's been closed for about 10 years now, I think. In my book, The Watchmaker's Revenge, I talk about Oliver Style's brother-in-law, who was a bit handy with his fist. He took part in a bare-knuckle boxing match up on Hersal Common at the top of Craven Street here, and he actually killed his opponent in 45 minutes of bare-knuckle fighting, killed his opponent. They came back here to the Coombe. Samuel Arnold was his name. He sat in the corner having a nice pint of ale, victorious, where the opponent, John Plant, he was still conscious. He was propped up in the corner with blood running down his face and a cup of tea. He didn't move, and eventually a cab pulled up here on Craven Street and took him back home to his house in St John Street in the city centre, where he died overnight. Samuel Arnold was tracked down and served 6 months for manslaughter. Really, he's not a very nice character, but interestingly, the story of Samuel Arnold, his daughter Alice became the first female mayor of Coventry in the 1930s. So a really interesting generational story from there. Now, the pub next to it, the Hersal, second or third dark story from Chapelfields stories. This was opened after the coup, and initially the landlord of the coup objected to the licence application from a gentleman who tried to open the Hersal. Went to the magistrates' court to try and block that. And when the applicant basically told the magistrates that the landlord of the coup behind me had actually been claiming rates for 1 room, but he'd actually been using 3, that objection very quickly melted away, and the Hersal opened up. Now, the landlord of that pub in about 1857 was actually also employed as a plate layer on the railway. He was killed by a train on the railway while he was out of work. He was brought back here. His body was brought back here to his own pub for an inquest into his death. We hear a lot of that sort of story as we go around, and I'll explain why that happened. But now we're going to carry on walking up Craven Street towards another pub, the Craven Arms, and then we're going to stop and look at some of these on the way, some of the buildings on the other side, because the thing about Chapelfields is that it was self-contained. You think of Bourneville for Cadbury's and places like that. You didn't need to go into the city centre. They had shops, they had obviously had the pubs, they had a post office, they had a bakery. Everything you needed was within these 20 acres, these 4 streets. So it was very much self-contained. All the work you had was here. It was like a living factory, people crisscrossing across the road. Obviously you can imagine about the cars there. When it was set out in the 1846 plan, that it was specified that there was 60 foot between every house on every street. There was a 6-foot path. There's rudimentary underground sewage. It was really quite, for the time, 1846, a modern setup. And then obviously the plots of land were taken up quite quickly, and the houses built over those 20 years. And the watchmakers would rent those on a yearly basis, and then move as and when their income dictated. But if we can just have a look at, stop here for a moment, look over to this side of Craven Street, this little row of red brick buildings here. If you zoom in on around the windows, you might be able to see like where the modern bricks have replaced space where the old ones used to be. Because we've had, starting with a brown door, we've had a baker's, a grocery shop, one with a big window was a post office, and so on. This was a whole row of shops in the watchmakers' Victorian times. And a little bit further up, the double fascia, the wide fascia of that white building, was another pub called the Brewer's Arms. Closed in about 1917 and became a butcher's for about 30 years. And then after that was a grocer's. Again, a whole row of shops. Didn't need to go anywhere else to get your work, to get your drink, to get your provisions. And so quite often, people would be turning their houses into a small grocer's shop. They wouldn't have necessarily a shop window, but they just open the door. The front reception room would be turned into an area where they'd just have a little counter selling their provisions, and we hear about one of those as we get onto Mount Street in a short while. So we're going to carry on walking up as far as the Craven Arms, and we stop and look over that, and to give you a bit of an idea as to the sort of people that lived in these streets and where they came from. I think we have a question. Do we go?
Were the watches sold locally, just in Britain, or exported to Europe, the world?
Coventry watches were mostly made on a commission basis. They didn't produce these watches and then go to a shop. There may be someone who would be marketing them. The people in Chapelfields that were making the watches would really just be producing them, and then the watch finisher would check everything was sound, make sure the movement was right, make sure it was polished and engraved to the specification. He would deal with the chap who basically commissioned those watches, and the most they'd have would be perhaps 20 or 30 at a time. They wouldn't be placed in a shop as such, but certainly they'd be exported around the world. And now a Coventry pocket watch very, very desirable, and they're very expensive. So we'll stop here on look at the Craven Arms before we go down to Lord Street. Got the Craven Arms on the corner there. Was actually one of the later pubs. Chapelfields opened in the 1860s. Doesn't appear until the 1871 census, but it was only initially the first bit where the Craven Arms fascia is. The part with the Just Eat sign and the thing on the side there was actually a house, an independent house on its own right. It wasn't until the 1980s that the brewery bought that house. It was formerly a grocer's shop. It wasn't until the brewery purchased that house and knocked through to expand in that it opened up the size of the Craven Arms. Living in the greenhouse next to that was a man in probably for about 25, 30 years in the prime of the watchmakers era, a man named John Smith. Nice easy name to research when you're looking through the archives. He lived there with his son Frederick and a daughter, and eventually Frederick moved out when he got old enough, and he lived in the house next door, which was the old grocer's shop. And eventually the licence came up for the Craven Arms, and Frederick took over the licensee. He was also a watch jeweller living in that middle house, and he became the landlord of the pub for about 25 years actually, until 1910 when he died. In typical to the sort of social interests that I've got in history, a typical everyday thing that could happen anywhere really. In 1881, Frederick's 2-year-old son William was playing with some of his friends on this area outside the pub here. Can imagine it without any cars here. It was a dirt road, lots of horse manure, obviously the traffic then, and William and his pals were tasked with clearing up the horse manure from the road. There was a horse and cart coming up Craven Street where we'd just come from, but they were too busy with what they were doing. They didn't notice how close it had got. All the boys scattered, apart from 2-year-old William, who fell, and the horse ran over him and crushed his skull with its hooves. Absolutely horrific accident. His body was taken into the pub, laid out in the back there. He's where his father was the landlord. And the inquest into his death took place in this pub. As I said, with the rehearsal, and you'll hear again later in the tour, it's quite common in the Victorian era for inquests to be held in pubs, because it was quicker to convene an inquest in a pub which had a large back room. Generally there'd be a small bar, and then there'd be a seating area with every drink, and then the main tap room at the back. So those rooms could be very easily sealed off. The coroner would come in, convene a jury, and the inquest would be held in the back of the pub. That happens quite a lot. If you look in any newspapers of that era, you'll see inquests held in the Rose and Crown, Craven Arms, whatever. Now the landlords were quite happy because they received a small fee for hosting the inquest, and no doubt the morbidly curious, days for television, TikTok and everything, would come in the pub, have a couple of drinks and listen to the gory details. I'm sure it didn't happen, but you can always imagine having a poster or a window, all events catered for, weddings, funeral, inquests. Didn't happen, but I can easily imagine it was like a competitive income stream for the pub landlord. So all of these pubs that were here, there were probably about 9 pubs at one point, still quite a lot. Don't do it now, I'm pleased to say. It wouldn't be very nice walking in there and someone laid out in the back room. So what we're going to do now is walk down Lord Street, which is this road down the side here, and then there's a very large red brick building on the left hand side, which is our next stop. I'm just going to wait a moment because there's some traffic coming up. Okay, I think we're good to go. So as I said, there's 3 roads running off of the spine of Craven Street. Duke Street, which is a bit further down that way, opposite the 2 pubs, and then Lord Street here, and then Mount Street is on the other side. So what we're going to do for this brief tour is go down Lord Street. I'll tell you some of the stories which happened here, then we'll come back round on the old road and then up Mount Street to do some more stories down that way. But we're going to be looking at this very large building coming up on the right hand side now, well, your left. It's a very interesting because it's, I think, a symptom of what the social system was like in the 1860s, 1870s in UK, actually, not just Coventry, because education wasn't mandatory in England until 1880, and even then you had to pay to send your child to school, and it often meant that there'd be truancies because parents would rather have their kids working at home, apprentices, certainly in the watchmaking era, and doing that sort of thing. They had to pay to go to school, and the parents couldn't afford it. They'd rather have them at home working. Now this building behind me here is the Lord Street Sunday School. It's a religious facility mainly. It was set up in the early 1870s, attached to the Baptist Church on Queen's Road in Coventry, and it opened in the early 1870s. And it actually ran here till 1927 when it moved to Queensland Avenue, which is up by Hersal Common, big building there now. And it sat empty not for very long because an engineering firm took over it and ran it for a very, very long time till quite recently. But the Lord Street Sunday School taught religious history, scriptures, but they also had a gymnasium. They had a football team, they had needlework classes, all sorts of things going on. So it was a really good thing for the children of Chapelfields in probably 7 or 8 years before going to school was mandatory, to have the opportunity to get some form of education, and not just reading, writing and arithmetic, but life skills. I think that's really important, and it's a bit of foresight by the planners, because whoever built this had bought those 4 plots of land, one after the other, with the idea that they were going to build this. This is right back to the 1840s. It was a lot of forward thinking on that. It's now converted into 9 apartments. I don't know how much, but I'm sure someone will tell me at some point, probably at my price range, but I think you'll agree the building's absolutely lovely. And where the wooden thing there was previously the entrance to the Lord Street Sunday School, it had a porch on it. You can find photographs online of this actually if you do a Google search, and it had a nice brick porch which took a direct hit during the Coventry Blitz in 1940. It was lucky the building didn't go down. It almost went straight down the face of the building, knocked out the porch completely, left the building intact as it is there now. So we're going to carry on down Lord Street. I'm going to cross over. Hopefully I can do so without being run over. We do have a question. Let me just find out from my assistant what that is.
Can you repeat the question after I said it because they can't hear me?
Okay.
Were women employed in watchmaking?
Were women employed in watchmaking? Well, it was a time that we're carrying on walking as I'm answering this. It was a time where obviously women's jobs was to look after the home, the children and the family. Men went out to work. But certainly in watchmaking, there's a place just down the corner where we started the 4 provinces. Just outside there was one of the first watchmaking factories in Europe, predating Chapelfields, that mainly employed young women. It was a watch balance factory, which is probably one of the most finest details you can have. You needed people with small, nimble fingers, and they employed nearly exclusively women. And I think it probably was one of the earliest employers of females, certainly in Coventry, if not the country. Not just 1 or 2, but I mean, there's photographs of the inside of that factory, and the whole floor is filled with young ladies working in this industry. So it was a skill which necessarily, talking about the Lord Street Sunday School, they were teaching things such as sewing, that sort of work. It came in really, really useful for the pocket watch work. So we're going to have a look over this house over right opposite us now, briefly, and unfortunately another grim story, but that's what I'm all about. This is number 9 Lord Street. We'll just come back here. One of the watchmakers who was employed at a factory down the bottom of Lord Street here, named Richard Satchwell, he'd caught a cold effectively that turned into pneumonia, and he got it in his head that he was on his way out. He called the doctor. He was in bed. His wife let the doctor in the house there, and basically said, "What's the matter with me, doctor? If I'm going to die, I want to go quick." And the doctor said, "Don't be so stupid, man. You just got a bit of pneumonia. Just get some bed rest. You'll be okay in no time." He left. Doctor left the bedroom, went downstairs, told the wife the same story. Doctor left, and suddenly the wife heard a thump on the floor from upstairs. And he went down. She went upstairs to have a look, and her husband was lying dead on the floor. He'd swallowed sulfuric acid, which is probably a horrible way to go. But if you're going to don't want to linger on with a long illness, as Richard Satchwell thought he had, it probably was a quick way for him to go. Now his body was carried over to pub we just gone past back up there. It used to be there, called the Sundial, no longer there. In fact, it closed about 1911. But his body was taken into that. And just as we go past the Nursery Tavern there, that is the oldest pub in Chapelfields. Named after the nursery gardens that the 20 acres used to be part of. Weir's Nursery, the name of the foreground there. Again, lots of newspaper reports of inquest in that pub and some thefts that had gone wrong. This is obviously in the Victorian era. I don't want to casting aspersions on anybody today. But we're going to come back down to the bottom of Lord Street. Again, I know I'm rushing a little bit and I'm missing some stories that I normally would tell. We've got 45 minutes to get back to the hall for the panel discussion. We're going to come around the bottom of Lord Street now and then round this road, which is going to be quite noisy, so we're going to not stop along there, and then back up Mount Street for some more tales. One or two good ones, not all gruesome. Pleased to hear. We have another question. Kerry says.
To repeat it, how many people were employed in the watchmaking industry at its height?
That's a very good question. How many people were employed in watchmaking industry at its height? I think it's probably almost impossible to say. It was probably in Coventry, not just in Chapelfields, but still in Spon Street and Spon End, which was the original watchmaking areas. They were still fully employed with people. There was people in Chapelfields, there's people in Hillfields, to the north of Coventry. In any one of these factories here that we looked at earlier on, there'd probably be 70 people every day. Now, that's just in that one factory. I think you're probably looking at thousands of people. Previously, many of those people had been employed in weaving industry, which then sort of morphed into watchmaking, and when watchmaking died down in the 1880s, 1890s, people moved into the bicycle industry that had taken off in Coventry, and then from there into the motor car industry. So it's transferable skills going across those generations of Coventry people. And being the biggest employer of people in the city, I think you're talking about thousands of people employed in watchmaking in some degree or other. The apprentices themselves were basically boys in between the age of 14 and 15. They had to do a 7-year apprenticeship, and it was a very strict contract. And after that, they still had to do 2 years of experience working for someone else before they could become self-employed. So it was a big commitment to work in the industry. You wouldn't think, I'll just do that and I don't like it, I'll go and do something else. In the main, apart from watchmaking, there wasn't a huge amount. We'll hear a little bit about a chap in a minute when we get around the corner who wasn't employed in watchmaking, he was actually a railway driver. So there were other employments, but many thousands of people. Sorry, I can't get an exact figure on that for you. Yep, absolutely. Apologies. I will mention again, if you've got any questions, please feel free to text through the number. It's on the bottom of the screen. If you haven't gone full screen on watching this broadcast, there is a number on the bottom of the screen where you can just text some questions, and Kerry, who's with us, is picking those up and will be passing on to me. So we're on Mount Street now, which is one of the other main ones, and I think we need to cross over to this side of the road. Just make sure nothing's coming. And then we'll make our way up all the way at the top. You can see it's a very steep incline up to the Chestnut Tree pub at the end there. People say you can often give directions as to people asking how to get from A to B by turning left or right at a pub. I think if they came to Chapelfields, it would be very difficult to follow those directions. Now, obviously, whereas before the whole of Chapelfields was a sort of living factory, no cars, people crisscrossing in the streets, apprentices running around with parts and everything. It was almost alive with people. It's very different now. Watchmaking finished in the 1880s, 1890s, mainly due to American and Swiss watchmakers, American watchmakers creating much smaller, much faster, much cheaper parts due to the automated areas there. So it was a slow decline for Coventry, but they still stuck to the hand work, to the high quality, but much more expensive and much slower production. And eventually, when watchmaking finished, people had to go out of Chapelfields, trying to find more different sort of work. And it's just like it today. You've got people live here, but work outside in the main. Now we've got a story which is very sad. Typical, unfortunately, of the Victorian era. House on your right hand side there on Mount Street. One of the gentlemen not employed in watchmaking was a train driver, as I said. His name was Robert Farr. He's lived in Mount Street on this side with his wife Anne and their 3 children. The youngest of that child was just 3 months old. And unfortunately, Anne became extremely depressed since the birth of that 3rd child. We'd recognise it today as post-natal depression, but in the Victorian period, this is 1873, They didn't really know much about that. They just basically said, get on with it, get back to your work, snap out of it. You've got a home to care for. So Anne was left to her own devices, and it was often reported that she was seen sitting at the window, looking melancholy, looking sad. And one day Robert came home from work as a train driver, and he came here to find an empty house. And the neighbour said, oh, if you're looking for Anne, she's up in the New Inn, which is the original name of the Chestnut. We'll talk about that when we get there. Robert's no doubt thought, fantastic, she's up there having a nice drink, we're going to have an ale. He's gone up the pub expecting to find his wife sitting at a table with some friends. Instead, she was lying on the table in the back room of the pub. She'd become so depressed through a postnatal depression that she drowned herself in the back garden in the water butt. And her body was carried up to the pub, awaiting the coroner and the jury to arrive. Now you think that neighbour might have said to Robert, still yourself, we've got some bad news. Instead, let him go up there expecting to find his wife just waiting to have a drink. Very, very sad, and typical Victorian inquest at the time. The verdict was suicide while temporarily insane. Okay, now we're going to carry on walking up here, but while we're doing this, if you can look at the incline of this hill, I think you see it's quite a nice slope. And it brings to mind a really nice story that in 1999, a researcher, historian in Chapelfields went around visiting some of the older residents of the area. They were in their 70s and 80s by this point and remembered Chapelfields in the 1920s and 1930s. And these memories were sort of published in a little booklet called Memories of Chapelfields as a volume 2. It's definitely worth hunting out a copy if you can find one. This particular story is a man named John Overton. He was in his late 70s by the time he was interviewed. He lived up here on Mount Street, and he said that one of the things that he really enjoyed doing with his friends was building a go-kart. So their thing was to build a go-kart and then whiz down Mount Street from the top all the way down at the bottom. You can imagine by the time they got down here, they'd probably go in at a fair lick. The usual trick was they get to the bottom and then veer off to the left just before they got there. But on this one occasion, John said he remembered knew he wasn't going to get across the road, busy road, so he just threw himself off the go-kart, and the go-kart went skidding right across the road. Unfortunately, there was a tram parked there. It was the terminus of the tram depot in between Olseley Old Road and Coventry City Centre. The go-kart got wedged right underneath. When his dad came home, he got a bit of a beating for causing 4 hours of delays to the tram service in Coventry at that time. Quite a nice type of typical thing. I sort of remember when I was a kid not going into trams, but building go-karts and having fun in the street. Not sure you necessarily sort of see that so much now. So we're heading still up Mount Street. Oh, let's walk into a bin. I'm adding myself to a future tour. Don't worry about that. Hopefully we're running on time. We're making our way up to the community hall shortly. But when we get up to somewhere up here, I just want to look over at this lamp post on the far side here. Kerry, while we're walking up, do we have any further questions?
Yes, people miss the end of Poor Lady, so the story from down there.
Okay.
So let's keep walking.
Okay. Now I should have said that. Unfortunately, I should have said that. Obviously, while we're walking around, we're relying on the signal and the service we can get. If it's blocked out a little bit, you didn't hear the response to that thing about Anne. I'll repeat that now. Hopefully we're back in good service now. Unfortunately, Robert came home from work and been told she was in the pub at the top of the road. He went up the pub and there she was lying in the room at the back, laid out. She'd drowned herself in the water butt through this postnatal depression. Now, a happy ending that those 3 kids were brought up by Robert and Anne's sister. They didn't leave Chapelfields, they didn't leave Coventry. They were able to carry on with their lives as best they could. Now, also just on this, if it does drop out a little bit, the whole thing's being recorded, and the recorded video of the walk and the panel discussion, which will take place shortly, is going to be put on the website. So you won't miss anything through buffering. You will be able to hear everything that we're talking about today. Now, stopping here to have a little look at this lamppost there. I think, why are we looking at a lamppost? It's not very exciting, but it's a good indication of a really quirky thing which I think is typical of council understanding. In 1855, about 5 years after Chapelfields was really built up, the residents of Mount Street that we were on went to Coventry Council, the corporation, saying, can we have another lamppost in Mount Street, please? We've only got one. We want one at the other end. And basically the council said, yes, you can have one as long as you pay for it, because the boundary line of Coventry Corporation at that time ran right down this street where I am now. So if you lived in that end, you were in Coventry City Corporation. If you lived in the other end, you were in Elsdon Ward, and you weren't covered with your taxes. And the same thing happened 2 years later when there was a spate of youths running up and down Mount Street here, putting stones through windows, wrecking gardens and everything. They requested a police presence for a short time. They said, your taxis don't fund the police, so unfortunately we can't provide that. It wasn't until 1899 that the boundary pushed right out to cover the whole of Chapelfields, and so they got their second lamppost and the police beat. So we're coming up to one of my favourite stories on the tour. It's a bit of history in itself going on now, in that we spoke earlier on about many shops in Coventry, in Chapelfields, and a lot of them being individual grocers' shops that were built into people's houses. Now, by 1889, 1885, with the watchmaking industry dying down, people were looking for other ways to provide an income or boost their income. And some of these, as I said, were opening grocers' shops. And one of them we're just going up to is this building coming up on your right hand side now. As you can see, it's undergoing some repair work now. In fact, it had been left neglected since 1975. It was only last year it sold at auction, and the work's been done to turn it back into a house. Probably in a couple of months' time, that's all going to be rendered over. You won't even notice it was once a shop. And in fact, the door used to be in the middle with two windows there. In 1889, the owner of this house, as it was a watchmaker. He basically decided that he needed to get some more income. I know, I'll turn my house into a shop. He did just that. 2 years later, the family's cat had a litter of kittens. One of those was born dead, but it was a freak of nature. It had one head, but two bodies, 8 legs and 2 tails. The entrepreneur of the watchmaking had decided, I know, I'll get some customers to the shop. He had that cat stuffed and put in a glass case, and he put it on the counter in the shop, and then contacted the reporter from the Coventry Herald to come and have a look. And he did, and he wrote a really nice piece. If you can find it in the newspaper, it basically describes the cat and how lovely the shop was. It was basically a form of drawing people in. I don't know how long it was there. It was there for probably just until the novelty wear off. But you can imagine today, this would be the sort of chap who'd be phoning the BBC CWR radio, and they'd be sending out a roving reporter to come and have a look at that cat. It'd be a sensation on TikTok, no doubt. So we just got one last little bit to walk up to top of Mount Street. Do we have any questions, Kerry, at the moment?
If possible, can we get a repeat of the synopsis of the chestnut tree story when he gets back? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. This is with the drowning and the. Yeah. I think the chestnut tree story is we've got its own story to hear about in a moment, but sorry for the breakup in the signal there, but the synopsis is that poor Anne was suffering from post-natal depression following the birth of her baby, 3 months old. She was just left to get on with things effectively, and her husband came home from work to be told that if you're looking for Anne, empty house, if you're looking for Anne, she's up in the pub. So you're probably expecting after a hard day's work a nice beer or two. Instead of finding his wife sitting at the table with some friends, she was lying on the table in the back room. She drowned herself in the water butt in the back garden down on the house on Mount Street there. Very, very sad, but quite typical, sadly, of Victorian era, when they didn't understand this sort of mental depression and everything, and they certainly didn't know how to deal with it in the main. Interestingly, there was a newspaper report about the inquest up there that said that it wasn't the first time that she'd attempted suicide. I can't find any details of that, but you'd think there'd been alarm bells ringing that something was not right with poor Anne. But as I say, often at the time, there wasn't any welfare state. They didn't know how to care, just get on with life, and tragic ending on that. Now we're going to make our way up to the chestnut. There's got its own story in there. And And that's where we're going to finish this 45 minutes before we go into the hall for the panel part. As I said, there's lots and lots of story. Almost every house here has got a story on there. I normally do a 2-hour tour. This is just a 45-minute sample, if you like, of it, and I'm not used to walking backwards doing the tour, but it's certainly something I'll be adding to future offerings. We're just going to get. We got another question.
What's the most haunted place in Chapelfields?
Hello. The most haunted place in Chapelfields, I'm asked. That's a good question. I can only obviously think of one, which I'm about to tell you in a moment. But I'm sure there'll be more, and I'm sure there are people that might have had their own experiences that could perhaps text in or join us perhaps in the panel later on and let us know that. I'm not heavily into ghosts and hauntings, but there's certainly one story which I was told when I related the story I'm about to say now at the top of here, top of the pavement outside the Chestnut. Obviously, we're getting towards, we're after work hours now, so there's lots of cars zooming around. We're almost there, so I've almost made it. So, Chestnut Tree Pub was perhaps the second or third pub in Chapelfields, called the New Inn, obviously because it was a recent addition to the offerings in Chapelfields. You can't see it, but there's a chestnut tree in the car park on the other side, hence the name. It was renamed in 1971. In 1885, when the watchmaking industry was dying down, a man named William Rowe, watchmaker, was walking around despondent, depressed, no income. He had a wife and 7 children at home. He didn't have any work. So he was walking around Chapelfields trying to find something. Nobody had any work for him. So he went into the pub and ordered half an ale with the few pennies he had left. And he was just about to go and sit down and enjoy that half an ale. The landlady felt sorry and said, "Oh, would you like some bread and cheese to go with that? Take some comfort." He said, "That's very kind, thank you very much." And he went and sat in a corner somewhere in the pub. She went back 10 minutes later to find him lying dead on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd cut his throat with the bread knife in fit of insanity, depression. Again, his inquest was held in the pub. Now, when I was doing the walking tour in person a couple of summers ago now, I was standing here doing this, giving this tale, and the wife of the landlord basically said, "Oh my God, that explains it." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said that she and a couple of the barmaids had seen some white figure, ghostly, spirity thing hovering around in the pub. Couldn't work out why there was any sort of thing to it. Now, obviously, I don't know, but it gives a story that may have resulted in that. I was asked, did I know what the man looked like? This is from a newspaper report from the 1880s. Very difficult. All I can say is he was 35 years old. He wasn't going to be an old lady with a white dress on. So in terms of hauntings, that's the only thing I've ever heard. I'm sure if I looked into it, research things, I may find something. But again, in an area which is 175 years old next year, buildings wise, there's going to be a lot of history. You've heard some of the dark history today, some of the workings of the watchmakers. There's going to be some more grim stuff. And if you'd like to hear more of that, obviously come on the 2-hour tour. Now that's the end of this part of the show there. Do we have a question there, Kerry? Oh, okay. We'll be back at 8:05. We're going to take a short break now and then rig up in the community hall. We've got a panel waiting for us. It's quite apt that the location of that panel in the community centre at the back of the new St Mary Magdalene's, because that was consecrated in 1934, and while that was being built, there was a temporary structure where we're going to be going in a moment, made out of tin, called the Tin Tabernacle, and it had literally corrugated tin roof. And in these Memories of Chapelfields tour booklet, which I mentioned, talking about John Overton with his go-kart, there's a story about another old gentleman remembered as a boy having to go to Sunday school at the Tin Tabernacle. He said that every Sunday morning, all him and his mates prayed for rain because he couldn't hear a word that was being said by the reverend while that tin roof was being bombarded by the rain coming down there. So it's very apt we're going there now, and it's just starting to rain again. So hopefully you'll be able to hear us when we go in there. Hope you enjoyed that 45 minutes. We're going to have a short break now and we'll connect with you again in the community hall for the panel. Thank you.